Good afternoon. I think I know many of those in the room today. For those who don't know, my name is Paul Verico. I'm the global head of the Everest Sutherland Health and Safety Defence team. And I'm going to talk to you today about a theory which my partner Sarah Valentine and I wrote earlier this year, which was syndicated out across the IIRSM network. And as part of the session this afternoon, we're going to go to a place far, far away and a place much higher than we are in Yorkshire and Humberside, because I want to talk to you about the ascent of Mount Everest and the lessons that we can learn from rope theory. Rope stands for rest, stands for observation, stands for planning and empowerment. And over the next 45 minutes, you're going to hear from me, and you're also going to hear from a couple of experts who are going to discuss the power of sleep when we come to rest, and they're going to discuss with you psychological safety when we look at empowerment. As reference materials after the session, very welcome to have the slides. There are some videos which again you're very welcome to be able to embed and share around, and you're welcome to have the source materials, which are the 2 articles in the IIRSM magazine from the start of the year. So why rope, why Everest, and why is this of interest to you and I? Well, the reason is that as health and safety professionals, we're always made to look for root cause analysis when things go wrong. And often when people do things which are unexpected, it's really easy to blame them. And as a defense lawyer who gets involved typically when very large organizations suffer serious incidents and even fatalities, the problem tends to be that it's easy to kind of go, well, here's a process, here's a procedure. Jimmy, we'll call him, was trained in the policy and the procedure, but then Jimmy did something wrong, and it's Jimmy's fault that Jimmy's come to harm. And we all know that life isn't as easy as that. And sometimes we're so busy looking at the trees that we miss the forest. And what rope looks at are some of the organizational factors which all of us should consider when we're looking at proper safety management and also, importantly, incident investigation. So I'm going to take you through the start of rope. It's actually only 70 years since Everest was first scaled. In fact, in April, I went to dinner in London where Sir Edmund Hillary's son talked about his memories of his father and how his father's legacy of climbing Everest had been a profound part of his existence. I'm just going to read to you what Sir Edmund actually recorded in his account of the climb. He said this, and I won't try and put the accent on because my Australian, New Zealand accent doesn't work. After an hour's steady going, we reached the foot of the most formidable looking problem on the ridge, a rock step some 40 feet high. And now you and I know that's now called the Hillary Step after Sir Edmund's epic triumph. He said this, the rock itself, smooth and almost holdless, might have been an interesting Sunday afternoon problem for a group of expert rock climbers in the Lake District. But here, it was a barrier beyond our feeble strength to overcome. Despite the considerable effort involved, my progress, although slow, was steady. And as Tenzing paid out the rope, I inched my way upwards until I could finally reach over the top of the rock and drag myself out of the crack onto a wide ledge. As I heaved hard on the rope, Tenzing wriggled his way up the crack and finally collapsed exhausted at the top like a giant fish when it had just been hauled from the sea after a terrific struggle. Why was it so difficult? Because, as Sir Edmund himself said, it would have been a normal Sunday afternoon problem for a group of climbers in the Lake District. Well, the reason is that what's easy when we're rested, when we're used to the hazards, and when we don't have the issues that we're going to talk about when it comes to rest and planning, then we can surmount problems very easily. But as human beings, when additional factors become layered in, then issues start to arise. And just as for Sir Edmund, something that he could do with his kids on a Sunday afternoon became something that actually meant real peril to his life, things that we can normally do really easily can sometimes become really layered and difficult as we have to accept when we're tired and when we've not planned properly and when there's no psychological safety. So let's move into our take on Everest because now we're going to move through to 1996. And in 1996, they're what became known of as the adventure consultants' disastrous climb of Everest. And for those of you who are interested in the stories of Everest, the account by John Krakauer, Into Thin Air, which became the movie Everest, is going to be of real interest. Krakauer said that people's perceptions of their own abilities are amazingly far off the mark. And he gave an example. He said that one teammate was reduced to, and this is how we described it, a helpless, infantile state by his infirmities and needed extensive help to make it down the South Col. And yet he doesn't remember it that way. His view was it was just fine. He just needed a little bit of help. And maybe as risk professionals, you encounter the same thing, where individuals appear to you and I to be lacking in skills, but the reality is they don't perceive it in the same manner. I've just been working out of our Chicago office, and on the way back, I was reading Andrew Hopkins' book relating to Macondo and the disaster in which people died when Deepwater Horizon experienced the issues it did over a decade ago. And what Hopkins says in his book is that the real problem was competence, because people felt that they were unable to be able to articulate that maybe they'd not done a well test properly ever before, because they were in a situation where actually being able to speak up in that manner was difficult. And their recollection that they would discuss with their peer group was that actually it was all quite easy and they were mudratters and it was fine. And Hopkins looks at that as one of his underlying causes of that tragedy. And so in 1996, the firm Adventure Consultants took a number of people up Everest who probably were not at the elite athlete level of generations before. And as part of that, as we'll see, tragically 6 climbers lost their life. How does that relate to sleep? It's probably the biggest disease of our lifetime, because we're so regulated by blue light. We consider regularly that we will get away with having 4, 5, 6 hours sleep. We can become somewhat immune to the idea of a lack of sleep. And as I tell my 11-year-old son, when he wants to stay up on a Saturday night, it's just science. And the video that I'm going to play in a moment really makes that position. From a legal perspective, because of course I'm a lawyer first and foremost, there's a case in 2007, and those of you who've joined our Driving for Work course in the past may remember it, case of a man called Michael Ayers, and he was a kitchen fitter. And this was a road accident that actually tragically left him paralysed. And in 2007, he'd arrived at work at 3:30 a.m. after 4.5 hours sleep. He then set off with a colleague to fit a kitchen in Swindon, which was 111 miles away. They shared the driving, finished work at about 2:30 p.m, and they got another job in Devon, another 122 miles further on. While Ayres was driving from Devon, after finishing that job, to North London, he fell asleep, had a micro sleep, crashed, and lost the ultimate use of his limbs. The motto of the company was, eating is cheating, and you'll sleep when you're dead. I wouldn't recommend those as mantras to put above your work areas. The Lord Justice Ward, who gave the ruling, said he'd been put in that predicament because his employers had put him there. And I agree with that entirely. The judge added, this case is a strong financial reminder to employers of the need to manage occupational road risk. Companies need to be sure their employees are in a fit condition to drive and have had adequate quality sleep before getting behind the wheel. And it's that concept of sleep that always is a vexed conundrum for safety professionals. And it's a vexed conundrum because it's difficult to influence what people do when they're not at work. You've got colleagues with babies or young children, or you've got people who may, depending on your profession, have a second job, then actually regulating their rest is really difficult. Maybe the starting point is to recognize the problem. So we're going to move now into a video by Dr. Alana Hare, who's going to share her research in this area.
My name is Dr. Ali Hare and I'm a sleep specialist. This short video is all about the R of rest from rope theory. Van Dongen and colleagues in 2003 published research designed to explore the consequences of chronic reduction in sleep with a dose-response chronic sleep restriction experiment in which awake, cognitive and sleep physiology functions were monitored and compared to those for total sleep deprivation. The chronic sleep restriction experiment involved randomizing 48 healthy adults aged between 21 and 38 to one of 3 sleep doses, either 4 hours, 6 hours, or 8 hours time in bed per night, which were maintained for 14 consecutive days. The total sleep deprivation experiment involved 3 nights without sleep, 0 hours in the bed. Each study also involved 3 baseline pre-deprivation days and 3 recovery days. These experiments were conducted under laboratory conditions with continuous monitoring of behavioral, physiological, and medical factors. The study demonstrated that chronic sleep restriction periods of 4 hours or 6 hours per night over 14 consecutive days resulted in significant cumulative and dose-dependent deficits in cognitive performance on all tasks, including psychomotor vigilant performance, working memory performance, and overall cognitive performance. Chronic sleep restriction to 6 hours or less per night for 14 nights produced cognitive performance deficits equivalent to up to 2 nights of total sleep deprivation. Subjective sleepiness ratings over this period did show an acute response to sleep restriction, but on subsequent nights there were only small further increases in reports of sleepiness. And these reports did not significantly differ between the 6-hour and 4-hour conditions. This study demonstrated then that even relatively moderate sleep restriction can seriously impair waking neurobehavioral functions, even in healthy, relatively young adults. As sleep debt grows, individuals became less alert and had increased difficulty in following simple tasks. Reductions in attention like this can make a sleep-deprived person more prone to mistakes, increasing the risk of workplace or motor vehicle accidents. Perhaps more importantly, however, subjective sleepiness ratings suggest that subjects were largely unaware of these increasing cognitive deficits, explaining why many individuals do not recognize how impaired they are after a period of sleep restriction. This serves to emphasize that whilst after an acute period of sleep restriction we may be aware that we're tired and perhaps not performing at our best, as sleep restriction continues beyond 1 or 2 nights, we become increasingly less aware of our significant limitations, which can have a major impact on safety at work and on the road. Organisational leaders and managers may therefore themselves need to be vigilant to signs of sleep deprivation in workers, should ensure working patterns support healthy sleep, and should support employees to speak up if they are concerned about tiredness, sleep loss, or fatigue. Caffeine, of course, is the most widely used stimulant to counteract the effects of sleepiness, but it also produces important detrimental effects on subsequent sleep, especially when sleep is initiated at a time when the biological clock is sending a strong waking signal, such as during the daytime. Caffeine primarily works by blocking adenosine receptors. In the doses commonly consumed from coffee, tea, or energy drinks, between 60 and 300 milligrams per drink, acute caffeine promotes vigilance, attention, and mood by blocking adenosine receptors, particularly in conditions of insufficient sleep and increased sleepiness. Individual differences in the effects of caffeine on sleep and wakefulness have a biological basis in genetic variants that code for these adenosine receptors. Adenosine promotes the sleep drive, or a person's need for sleep. The sleep drive helps the body maintain sleep-wake homeostasis, or the right amount of sleep and wakefulness over time. Simply put, the longer a person stays awake, the stronger their sleep drive becomes. When a person is deprived of sleep, the sleep drive prompts them to sleep more intensely and for a longer period of time the next time they sleep. Adenosine is probably involved in this adaptive homeostatic response to the prior duration of sleep and wakefulness, as its levels rise in the course of sleep deprivation and decrease during recovery sleep. Recent research conducted with mice suggests adenosine also affects circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are the multiple physical changes that occur over each 24-hour day, including the sleep-wake schedule. You are likely aware of melatonin, a circadian rhythm hormone that promotes sleep by reacting to light and darkness. Similarly, adenosine also appears to influence sleep timing in response to light and darkness, as well as in response to recent sleep history, as I've described before. However, whilst caffeine is effective at reducing sleepiness, the consumption of caffeine in response to insufficient sleep may impair the onset and maintenance of subsequent sleep. A systematic review and meta-analysis investigated the effects of caffeine on the characteristics of nighttime sleep, aiming to identify the time after which caffeine should not be consumed prior to bedtime. Caffeine consumption was found to reduce total sleep time by 45 minutes and sleep efficiency by 7%, with an increase in the time taken to fall asleep and the time spent awake during the night. The duration and proportion of light sleep increased with caffeine intake, whilst the duration and proportion of deep sleep decreased. The authors of this study therefore recommended that in order to avoid reductions in total sleep time, coffee should be consumed at least 9 hours prior to bedtime, and a standard serve of a pre-workout supplement of around 200 milligrams of caffeine should be consumed at least 13 hours prior to planned bedtime. In a work situation then, where workers may have suffered from the cumulative effects not only of reduced sleep, perhaps from working prolonged hours or shift working, but also the impact of family circumstances, poor sleep hygiene, sleep problems, or enhanced wakefulness from caffeinated drinks, safety can be impaired. The rope theory case study of the Everest ascent is one extreme example, but it doesn't need to be as extreme as this. Thinking about the importance of sleep and the impact of sleep in our day-to-day working environments can help us provide a better and safer environment for our teams, and should always, therefore, be a key area of management focus. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hare. Interesting when she talks about 9 hours before going to bed for your last cup of coffee. So for many of you, if you've currently got a brew, change it for tea. Also, that whole point about pre-workout supplements effectively means that if you're going to use pre-workout supplements, you need to use them in the morning. And once you kind of go past mid-morning, they're going to impact your sleep that evening, which I just thought was a really interesting piece. So that is the R of rope theory. If you want references, Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, is an absolutely excellent resource that looks at both Van Dongen's study and others linked in relation to the importance of fatigue. Let's now move then to the O of rope theory, which is observation. Do you empathise with the people on the slide? Maybe buying out an hour right now to be able to listen to me gives you this kind of stress. I don't know. On Everest, people could develop pulmonary edema, which is where they became lightheaded. They actually get a bleed in the brain, and it's life-threatening. And if they're not being observed and if people aren't watching them and checking how they are, then actually it can prove fatal. What's really interesting is that if you get altitude sickness on Everest, there's only one real answer, and that's actually to move down the mountain. Because if you keep going, eventually you'll become very ill indeed. And in the lives that we live, the fast-paced, stressful lives that we live, sometimes we can keep forging on, thinking that we're doing the right thing. But what we really need to do is to just kind of pull back a little bit, walk down the mountain. And that's where observation comes in. Because with the observation, it isn't just about checking that people are building widgets properly or that they're filling in the paperwork correctly. Observation is about your team and knowing the stresses that they're under and being able to help them. To be able to understand, most importantly, how that works, the Health and Safety Executive's guidance on human factors talks about the factors of the built environment as well as the interpersonal relationships within the team. Again, referring back to Hopkins' book on, and I've all the Hopkins books on my bookcase in front of me, actually, but the Hopkins books all talk about that interpersonal peer group pressure when he looks at both Texas City and indeed when he looks at Longford and Macondo, to suggest that those peer group relationships are incredibly strong in both helping, but potentially being a negative factor in the way that people behave. So our job as risk professionals is to observe on a macro level what the working environment is like and how people are interacting. And we may think that's more of a HR job, but most of us tend to have got well-being somewhere in our title. But then on a micro level, both the people we report to and the people who report to us, to be able to really tune into what their stresses are and whether there are appropriate mitigations to deal with that. We don't have time today to talk about well-being because, of course, that's something that we could spend hours on. But I did just want to share with you a case study that one of my colleagues was involved in the middle of lockdown. And it goes something like this. The person who got injured was an experienced operative, and she worked in a food production firm, and she was working on a production line that was next to the one that she normally worked on. During the pandemic, she'd gone from being a normal operative to a senior operative because the people who she normally worked with, who were the senior operatives, were shielding. So she was working in the senior position. The line was automated, but cleaning and product changing were done manually. The workers' shift patterns now accommodated social distancing, they accommodated split shifts, and her partner had been unable to work and was also not eligible for furlough, which meant that she was responsible for household income. In addition, her mum at the time had got COVID-19 and she was delivering essential supplies to her daily. She got a lot on her plate. And because her mum was poorly, she was being really careful about not catching anything herself. The operative worked 6 days a week, including some night shifts, and was responsible for training her fellow colleagues. While she was working in this way, she found the new job quite challenging. She'd received some training and she reviewed the risk assessment and risk management documentation. She'd been given it, she'd read it, she'd signed to say she'd read it. People who she worked for considered to be one of the most diligent operatives, but no one really observed how she was in that circumstance. The wellbeing policy wasn't particularly embedded, and of course we're in the middle of the pandemic. The workforce felt lucky to have a job. The ethos was the work had to be done, and the mental health concern is a bit of a waste of time. And so we get to the evening, 9 o'clock, a junior operative caught their fingers in the belt rollers, sustaining life-changing injuries. Although the experienced operative had supervised the product change, she'd failed to check that the guarding of the belt had been replaced properly. She'd been running to plan with no faults or issues noted. She'd changed products several times that week and hundreds or thousands of times in total. And when it came to the investigation, the starting point was that people wanted to blame her for not following the process. But the reality was that she got so many other factors whizzing around her head that her performance and judgment were affected. Lapses of concentration, panic, and a lack of confidence. It's really important for us that we think about burnout in that situation and really being able to keep an eye on the metrics that help us to be able to say what it is that can be done to help people when things are difficult for them. Let's go to P, planning. Krakauer in Into Thin Air talks about Rob Hall, who during the ascent of Everest was the leader of the company. In fact, there were several companies that were trying to climb Everest in this very narrow window in May, which is the perfect conditions for an ascent. 4 days before they made their final ascent, another party returned without summiting, and Rob Hall had said to Krakauer, I'm really impressed. It's incredibly good judgment to know that actually, if you continue climbing, you're probably going to die, and to actually have the foresight to be able to turn around. So he knew what the risks were. And that individual who turned around had obviously done what we would say was a proper risk assessment. In fact, I'm at this level. If I push on, the risks are going to be too severe. My risk assessment says my mitigation is to drop down the mountain and try again next year. He'd looked at the foreseeability of the risk. Now, Hall, who was going up 4 days later, had said to his climbers, his work party, when I'm on the mountain with you, I will tolerate no discussion. My word is law, and you will do what I tell you. Turnaround time is when you get so high, and actually, if we've not made the summit, we've got to come back down regardless. Turnaround time was 2:00. And if at 2:00 we're still on the mountain, then we all turn around and we don't make a summit today. When they started their ascent, and bearing in mind people have spent tens of thousands of pounds, and there's all these other pressures of other companies trying to get to the top of the mountain as well, there were problems. There were delays en route. Some of the ropes weren't in position. There's a bit of an ego battle between two of the companies, and some of the fixed ladders weren't where they should be. The lead climbers got delayed, and Hall did an on-the-hoof dynamic risk assessment. He changed his 2:00 to 4:00 and lost his window. So he got people to the top, then he couldn't get back down again. Storm, plummeting temperatures meant the initial mitigations were hopelessly overwhelmed. The climbing party had difficulty planning and staying on the agreed route, and they were overcome with exhaustion. Now, we know that planning is one of the fundamentals of modern life. When we set out mitigations, we need to really think about what-if scenarios. And there's a whole body of work, which many of you will be familiar with, of high reliability organizations. Todd Conklin talks about them at great detail. And high reliability organizations don't just look at simple solutions. They try and make sure that they look at things in the most complicated way possible, so that they've really anticipated what-if scenarios. Daniel Kahneman, in his book from last year, Noise, talks about how groups amplify noise. If groups learn the views of component members, social influence diminishes, and people don't feel that they're making an individual decision, and they can rely upon the collective. As a result of that, they feel less accountable, and they're more likely to take dangerous or riskier decisions. So in that way, groupthink becomes a problem, because without the accountability of someone having to sign it and say, this is me, I'm putting my neck on the line, I think this is right, when people rule by consensus, plans can change and develop and metamorphosize in sometimes quite ugly manners. When we investigate incidents here at Eversheds, we often find that people are well-intentioned at the start. We're doing a job at the moment in Wales where there is a process and a procedure that's got 70 steps in it. Douche, 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 douche. And that's fine. And if people follow the 70 steps, there's no problem. On the day of the incident, someone didn't come to work. It's a two-person work party job. Someone doesn't come to work because they ring in sick. And rather than stop the work that's planned, an individual goes to do some tasks on his own that were always planned to be done in pairs. And the mitigations don't catch up, and he ends up being exposed to something pretty noxious. The problem is that failure to respond in a timely what-if position. Todd Conklin in 2017 in his book Pre-Accident Investigation says, prevention efforts can't prevent causes that were not expected, just as planning can't plan for unexpected events. We're so invested in preventing all accidents, we don't build the ability for our systems to recover if the accident happened. We investigate to determine how we failed to prevent the bad thing from happening, rather than thinking out what we should have done to consequentially catch something negative once it's begun. So in observation, it's really important that proper monitoring is carried out to make sure that we've really thought about the difference between what we call, there we go, work imagined compared to work as done. And there's the an example decision tree. So planning in rope theory is about making sure that we've considered the diamonds as well as the boxes in a flow diagram to make sure that if people could respond in the incorrect manner, that's been considered. Where does that map through to law? Well, in the 2016 Sentencing Guideline for Health Safety and Food Hygiene Offence and Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide in the UK, there is a line, I think it's on the second page, in relation to harm, and it says that the actions of victims will seldom be considered relevant in relation to the sentencing exercise. What does that mean for you and me? Is that we've got to accept that sometimes people do stuff that at first blush seems daft, because humans are unpredictable, which is why high reliability organisations consider those what-if scenarios. That takes us through to empowerment, the final part of rope theory. And again, let's just have a look at Krakauer and Rob Hall's ascent in 1996. Krakauer said that as he began his descent, because he summited before some of the rest of the party because he was quite a good climber, he said he noticed wispy clouds forming around other Himalayan peaks. We didn't think anything of it. A fellow climber, who was a pilot by trade, told Krakauer later that those wispy clouds are the crowns of robust thunderheads. That climber who spoke to Krakauer had actually turned around well before 2 o'clock because he'd seen the thunderheads and thought there's going to be trouble here. He did not communicate that to Rob Hall or to any of the other climbers. Why not? Because he was mindful of Hall's admonition that I am effectively God on the mountain. And empowerment is about that whole psychological safety piece. Rather than people being diminished and are only acting in their own interests, what are they doing as a group? Conklin again says, workers should have the ability to be able to do work in a varying and unpredictable world, or to have the capacity to be able to deal with things as they occur. Amy Edmondson, in her book, The Fearless Organisation, some of you will have seen that she's brought a new book out that's a couple of months old. She talks about being in a VUCA environment, a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment. And what she means by that is that our job as risk professionals is to make sure that people are able to speak up when something does become uncertain. Teams with high psychological safety have a safety focus which enables them to be able to really think through issues. And Edmondson's work, which was in a help situation, effectively said that organisations that seem to have lots of near misses or incidents are actually the ones that are less likely to kill you. Those that had very few incidents or reported incidents tended to be the dangerous ones because they didn't feel able to speak up and raise things, whereas ones that had a learning attitude approach did much better. So let's understand a little bit more about Amy Edmondson in our final video by Tom Geraghty, the founder of Psychological Safety.
Hi, I'm Tom Geraghty, the founder of psychsafety.com, where we work to make the world of work a psychologically safer, more inclusive, equitable, and high-performing place. I've read Paul and Sarah's rope theory of rest, observation, planning, and empowerment, and I'm really pleased that empowerment forms part of their rationale for improving organizational safety performance. I believe that high performance means everyone on the team enjoys and is fulfilled by what they do. A team is only as safe as the least safe team member. And safety, psychological safety, is a prerequisite for empowerment. Risks are mitigated and hazards are spotted best when the safety climate of an organization is open and transparent, which is essentially the foundation of psychological safety. Psychological safety being the belief that you will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. First coined in the 1960s by Edgar Schein and Warren Bennis, psychological safety really came to prominence in the late 1990s when Amy Edmondson was studying high-performing and low-performing clinical teams. And what she found was that high-performing clinical teams were making more mistakes than the low-performing teams, and that didn't make sense. When she dived into the data a bit further and when she did a bit more research, what she found was that high-performing teams were admitting and talking about their mistakes, and the low-performing teams were hiding theirs. And of course, that starts to make sense, doesn't it? It's only by talking about and admitting our mistakes that we can learn and improve continuously from them. The low-performing teams who hide their mistakes, conversely, are stuck in the low-performing zone until something else changes on the team. Previously, psychological safety was an implicit component of ideas like crew resource management in aviation, just culture in healthcare, the Toyota production system. But now, psychological safety is part of our wider work-life lexicon, part of our shared language, which is really, really powerful. Because it's only by having language for something that we can understand it, and more importantly, take concrete actions to build, foster, and maintain it. And if I was going to suggest just one thing to immediately change the psychological safety climate in your teams and your organization, it's simply reframing. Reframe work as an experiment, an opportunity to make something better and do it better next time. The outcome of work shouldn't just be the job itself, but learning how to do it even better next time. An experiment. After all, the only experiment that fails is the one we didn't learn from. Thanks for learning, thanks for watching, and stay safe.
Tom's newsletter is excellent and is highly commended. Okay, so as we wrap up psychological safety, the case study here is of a situation that occurred 7 years ago, a client of ours, where an individual sadly lost his life when a machine fell on him. When we did the investigation, we found that the individual who suffered the awful incident had got several previous incidents against his name, but which had never been recorded on his HR file or never been centrally recorded. And the reason for that was because the organization was incentivized towards zero harm, zero lost time. And so things had just never actually been dealt with. And as a result of that, the empowerment of the local managers was that they felt unable to escalate because it would impact ultimately their bonus system. We've got to be really careful not to incentivize underreporting. Here are some examples of people and what they've said to us in relation to psychological safety. And I think that the one that really strikes me is the bottom right one. You cannot have faith in people unless you take action to develop them. And it's a well-known trite phrase that people don't leave organizations, they leave bad leaders. So are we doing our bit to empower people in our team? And it's the people that make organizations work. Those of you who've seen me present before or been to conferences that I've spoken at will know that I'm a big believer in watermelon safety. The idea that we can have effectively something that's green from the outside, but it's red on the inside. So you've got some kind of external audit that kind of goes, oh, you know, from 45,001's perspective, it's all great. We've got policies and procedures. When you go and talk to people at the water cooler, it's kind of doomsday language that there's an accident waiting to happen. And that's really the point of rope theory, that there can be these indicators, rest, where people, you know, you look at them and you're like, you've not slept for a bit, you're clearly strung out, or you see people necking Red Bull or Monster, whatever it might be. Observation, where actually you can see that people are struggling, but people aren't actually bringing their workload down. Just there's always another emergency. There's always something else that we need to be full power on. Where there are plans, but the plans get changed because it'll be all right. And then when there's this toxic environment where people don't feel empowered to speak up, that's when there's a problem. And so what I'd be recommending to you is that these matters, rest, observation, planning and empowerment, hold the safety management system together. Just like it's possible to summit Everest and come back down safely, in our careers, there will be times when we face fairly insurmountable obstacles. With all of these things, thinking about the rope theory will help us to be more efficient as risk and safety professionals, but it also really help our organizations to exercise their organizational resilience to enable them to better encounter those hazards and deal properly with them. My name is Paul Verico. I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. Otherwise, it's been great to see you all. Even though I can't see you, you can just see me.
Thank you, Paul, for a really interesting presentation. We haven't had any questions yet. If you'd like to pop them now in the questions box or raise your virtual hand and I can unmute you so you can ask your presentation in person, now is the time. So nothing's coming through yet. Do you have any, usually if I ask if you've got any closing thoughts, people usually ask a question. So I'll ask you what I ask everyone else. Have you got, have you got any thoughts to leave us with?
I do. I'll leave you with the words of Nick Ross on Crime Watch. Don't go home and have nightmares about anything you've seen here today. It's really important with these things. For me, the respite of this is it's just science. And we see so many people that when you go and do an incident investigation, particularly because my work, let's face it, is normally really bad things happening to fairly good people.
Yeah.
And the amount of times that you look at the shift pattern, you're like, they've worked 70 hours this week, 65 hours last week. They're clearly supping Monster or whatever else or chemical they're putting in their bodies, and they're strung out, they're knackered. And it's just science. It's just science. So I really would recommend people to think quite closely about shift patterns, to really think about the way in which they're managing that fatigue index, and then whether or not that spills out into workplace road driving or not. Clearly, that should factor. So the research is really strong on sleep, and I really would recommend everyone on this call to go away and just have a little think about that. And as I say, very happy to share my slides and the videos without any copyright. Just feel free to use them. There's no issue with that at all. I would recommend Matthew Walker's book because it is absolutely excellent.
Great. If anybody would like a copy of Paul's slides or videos, just email branches@IIRSM.org and I'd be happy to pop those across for you. I was quite fascinated by the effects of caffeine, but thankfully I only have one cup in the morning.
You and me both. I'm very much I've got to that age now where anything after 9 o'clock in the morning and I'm done. So yeah.
I'm a big fan of the decaf now, which I tend to like better than the actual caffeinated, but I can't give up my machine coffee first thing in the morning.
I'll send you one. Good to see you. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Really good to see everybody.
Thanks everyone. Just to remind everyone that the recording will be uploaded onto the IIRSM YouTube channel either later today or tomorrow. So if you want to share it with any colleagues, please feel free to do so.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Speak soon. Bye.
Bye.